I had no choice when they said that marriage was the only way to stop the war. Nobody asked what I wanted. No one considered what that meant to me. They just decided, and I was handed over as part of a deal that never should have been. I remember the exact moment I heard the decision. The words still echo in my mind like they never left. They said it was necessary. They said it would save lives. They said it was an honor, but there was no honor in being used that way. There was no choice. The war was already too close. The territories were already preparing, and any spark could turn everything into destruction. So they found a simple solution. Use me. I was prepared quickly. No time to question, no room to refuse. They dressed me like a bride, but there was no joy. There was no expectation. Just silence, a heavy silence that seemed to swallow everything around me. The journey to his territory was long, every step further from everything I knew, every moment getting closer to something I didn't understand. They said he was dangerous, unpredictable, who ruled with force and without mercy, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who crossed his path. And still, he was the one I was supposed to marry when I finally arrived. Nothing was as I expected. The territory was organized, controlled, silent in a way that didn't feel like fear. It felt like respect. The looks on me were intense, loaded with judgment. I wasn't welcome there. I was a symbol, a piece, placed in a larger game. One was taken to the center of the territory where everything seemed to revolve around a single presence. And then I saw him for the first time. He didn't look like a monster, but he didn't look like someone ordinary either. There was something about the way he held himself, in the way everyone around reacted, absolute control. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, everything around. There was no anger, there was no curiosity analysis, only as if he was trying to understand exactly what they had placed before him. The wedding took place without emotion, no celebration, no unnecessary words, just a ritual, an agreement, being sealed in front of everyone. I remained firm, without showing weakness, even though I felt like I was being watched every second. When it was all over, I was taken to the place where I was now, as his wife. The idea seemed distant, almost unreal, because none of it felt like a wedding. It felt like a silent prison. I waited, not knowing what would come, not knowing how he would act, not knowing if everything they said was true. The minutes passed slowly. Every sound seemed louder than it should. And then he entered, no rush, without hesitation. His presence completely changed the atmosphere. I prepared for anything, for any reaction, but nothing happened. He just watched me for a few seconds, as if he was evaluating something he hadn't yet decided. And then he said something I didn't expect, said that marriage meant nothing to him. The firm voice, direct, no emotion. But there was something more there, something I couldn't identify right away. He said he didn't ask for that I didn't need an alliance, maintain control, and that I shouldn't expect anything. Those words should have been a relief, but they were not, because there was something strange, something out of the ordinary. He did not show ordinary rejection, showed no interest. It was as if I simply didn't exist within his logic, and it made me more uneasy than any other reaction could. He walked away. Without getting closer, without trying to touch, without even considering the idea and what a marriage should be, it became something else, something undefined, something I still couldn't understand. That night I understood that there was something wrong, not with me, but with everything around that situation. 'Cause if it really was all it was cracked up to be, he would not have refused. I wouldn't have kept my distance. And that only meant one thing. There was something I still didn't know. Something much bigger than that deal. And for the first time since it all began, I realized that maybe I hadn't been sent just to prevent a war. Maybe I had been placed there without understanding the real reason, and that made everything even more dangerous. And that made everything even more dangerous. Because the more I thought about it, it became clearer that I didn't understand the game I had been placed in. If that marriage was just a deal to avoid war, so why didn't he make any point of fulfilling it as such? Why keep your distance? Why act like I have no value within the alliance itself? That wasn't just disinterest, it was a decision, and decisions like that always had a reason. I spent the first few days watching in silence, without interfering, without attracting The only way to understand something, the territory worked differently than I knew. There was no chaos. There was no visible fear. People moved with purpose, with discipline, and that didn't fit with the image they had sold me. I started to notice details, the way he was respected. Not just feared, the way his decisions were followed, no question. But also, without hesitation, this wasn't dominance based on strength alone. It was built control, and that made me even more alert. Because it meant he wasn't predictable. And men like that were the most dangerous. Even avoiding any direct proximity, I felt when he was around, it was impossible. Not to notice the environment changed, people adjusted, and there was always that subtle silence that preceded his presence. But the strangest it was that he kept ignoring me. Not completely, but enough to make it clear I wasn't part of his priorities, and that bothered me more than it should have, because I wasn't used to being irrelevant, much less within something as big as that deal it was on the fourth day. That something changed, not obviously, but noticeable enough. I was in the courtyard observing the movement as I have done since I arrived, when a small group entered through the main gate. The tension was immediate, not external but internal. The looks changed, postures became more rigid, and that meant trouble. One of the men was injured, visible blood, limited movements, but it wasn't just that, it was the way others were reacting. This was no ordinary accident. It was a consequence of something bigger. I got close enough to hear without seeming too interested. Loose words began to make sense. Other territory, unusual movement limits being tested. The war that had theoretically been avoided, it was still there, just waiting for the right moment. And that confirmed what I already suspected. The marriage hadn't resolved anything, just late. It was then that he appeared, as always without warning, but impossible to ignore. The silence deepened, not out of fear, but by expectation. He heard the full report without interrupting, without showing immediate reaction. But I saw small changes, almost imperceptible, in the way he absorbed each information, and that was enough. He was already thinking several steps ahead. When the story ended, he didn't raise his voice, did not demonstrate urgency, but every word I said carried weight. No one would leave without authorization. No action would be taken without direct order. Simple but absolute, and that calmed the atmosphere almost immediately. His control did not come from force, it came from certainty, and it made me realize something I didn't want to admit. I felt safe. Even though I know I shouldn't, even though I knew that place wasn't mine, even though I knew I was stuck in a deal I didn't choose. Still, there was a strange feeling, as if inside, nothing happened without his permission. And that was too dangerous, because security creates and trust creates weakness. I tried to ignore it, back to what made sense, but it wasn't that simple. Because the more I watched, I realized that there was something out of the ordinary in that story. And that something always led to him. That same night, I finally understood that his distance wasn't disinterest, it was control he was maintaining. Clear boundaries, but not for lack of options, by choice, and that only raised more questions. Because if he didn't want me there, he could just reject the deal, but he didn't. If he didn't need the wedding, why accept it? Why keep everything running? And most importantly, why keep me there, without using me, without discarding me? The answer didn't come at that time, but the feeling remained strong, constant, like a silent warning. I wasn't just a cog in that deal. I was part of something that hadn't yet been revealed. And the more time passed, it became clearer that the real reason for that marriage, it was still hidden. And when it came to light, nothing I believed in until now would hold up. Nothing I believed in until now would hold up. This feeling never left me. She grew up in silence, fitting into every detail that I began to notice, because the more I observed that territory, but I understood that everything there was calculated. Nothing was done on impulse, nothing was left to chance, and that included my presence. I started to analyze the way I was treated. There was no direct hostility, but there was no acceptance either. It was like everyone knew exactly what I stood for without needing to say. An alliance, a risk, an uncertainty, and at the center of it all, him. But still far away, always present, but never close, until that changed in a subtle way, but impossible to ignore. I was in the courtyard again, watching like the days before, when I noticed something different. The gazes were not just focused on the common movement, they were in me. Discreet, fast, but constant. That wasn't common, not like that. And then I understood something had changed. Not in the territory, but in the way I was being seen inside him. And this became even clearer when I was called Directly, no explanation, without warning, just a simple order to go to him. My body reacted before I even thought, maintaining posture, controlling expression. But inside, the tension increased immediately, because that kind of call didn't happen for no reason. When I entered, he was already there. As always, calm, property, observing, but this time, the atmosphere was different, more direct, more focused, like there's no more room to keep your distance. I stopped in front of him without looking away, without showing fear, and I waited. He didn't speak right away, just watched me for a few seconds. But it wasn't the same analysis as before. It was deeper, more accurate, as if he was already past the suspicion stage and I was confirming something. Then he asked, not about me directly, but about the territory, about what I had seen, about what I understood. That didn't make sense. Not for someone in my position, but I responded carefully, without delivering more than you should, without seeming too vague, and even so, I knew he was seeing beyond words. Always been. When I finished, silence returned. But this time it wasn't long. He took a step forward, closing the distance between us without completely invading, but enough to change the weight of that moment. And then he said something that stuck. Said I watched too much, that this was not common, and that people like that always had a reason. That wasn't a direct accusation, but it wasn't a simple observation either. It was a warning, and at the same time a test. My body remained still, but my mind quickly adjusted. I couldn't back down, couldn't justify too much. Any excess would be a mistake. So I just said that observing was the only way to understand where I was. The answer was simple, but it carried enough truth to sustain. He kept looking for a few more seconds, and then something changed again, almost imperceptibly. The tension hasn't gone away, but it changed, and that was even harder to interpret, because it longer just seemed suspicious. There was something beyond, something I still couldn't define. He walked away first, as if I had decided to end that moment. But before you turn around, said something that changed everything. He said that in that territory nothing went unnoticed for long, and that truths always found a way to appear. The sentence was calm, but loaded, because it wasn't just a rule, it was directed, and I felt it clearly. When I left there, I was no longer the same, because now there was no doubt. He knew not everything, but enough. And even so, I hadn't done anything. I hadn't left. I hadn't exposed myself. And that was what worried me most, because it meant he was waiting for me to show something, waiting for me to make a mistake, or maybe waiting for me to make a choice. And that possibility was the hardest, because for the first time, I felt like I wasn't just being watched. I was being led in a silent way, controlled to a point I still couldn't fully see, but it was already starting to take shape. And when it finally revealed itself, I knew there would be no more room for doubt, just for consequence. That was the only certainty that remained after that meeting. Nothing there was random, nothing happened without intention, and now I knew I wasn't out of it either. I was part of his calculation, even without fully understanding how. In the days that followed, the change was subtle but constant. People kept acting the same way. The territory maintained the same rhythm, but the way I was inserted in that space was no longer the same. I started to be included, not officially, not declared, but present enough to realize conversations that used to cease when I approached. Now they just toned it down. Looks that previously avoided contact, now they evaluated. And that only meant one thing. I was being measured, not as a direct threat, but as a variable. And that made everything more delicate, because any misstep now would carry real weight. It was during one of those almost invisible that something happened, something small for those watching from the outside, but decisive for those who were inside. I was called again, but this time not for an isolated conversation. I was taken to one of the rooms where decisions were made. There was no exaggerated formality, but the environment, I made it clear, that wasn't common when I entered. The looks came immediately, fast, direct, and then they passed, as if my presence had already been anticipated. He was there as always, but this time I wasn't alone. Others were around. Men who clearly held important positions. The tension in the environment was not hostile, but it was dense, loaded with expectation. I remained silent, observing, absorbing, and then the discussion continued. Neighboring territory, strategic moves, possible ruptures, everything that confirmed what I had already realized. War never ceased to exist. She just changed shape. The most unexpected, that's when he included me. Without warning, no preparation, he asked a question, simple in shape, but heavy in context. I wanted to know what I thought, not as a wife, not as a symbol, but as someone who came from outside. That changed everything because it was no longer observation. It was participation. My first instinct was to refuse, keep distance, avoid direct involvement, but I knew in there this would be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as concealment. So I said with caution, but firmly, I pointed out what seemed obvious, that the movements were not isolated, that there was coordination, that someone was testing limits before actually taking action. The silence that came after it was different from everyone else. There was no rejection, no immediate approval. There was analysis they were considering, and that was more impactful than any direct answer. He didn't say anything right away, but his look changed again, and this time I understood better. It was no surprise. It was confirmation, as if that fit something he already suspected. The discussion continued, but now based on what I had said, and it put me in a position I couldn't deny. I was no longer just part of the deal. I was in on the strategy. When it was all over, people left little by little. No unnecessary comment. No questions, execution only. I was last, not by choice, but because I knew he wasn't finished, and I was right. When we are alone, silence returned, but it wasn't uncomfortable, it was calculated. He approached slowly, no rush, no pressure, and stopped at a shorter distance than before, enough to make it impossible to ignore his presence. Then he said something that changed the way I saw everything. He said that utility always outweighs intention, that it didn't matter why someone did something if that brought results that defined the value. The words were direct, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't interested in who I was, but what could I offer? And for the first time, it didn't bother me, because within that context, it made sense more than anything else. I didn't respond right away, because any impulsive reaction there would be a mistake, but I didn't back down either. I kept looking, maintained the posture, and I accepted what that meant. Without saying it out loud, he watched for a few more seconds, as if evaluating this silent choice, and then he walked away, ending the moment without needing to say anything else. When I left there, the feeling was unlike anything I had felt before. It wasn't just tension anymore, or doubt, it was clarity. I had crossed a limit even without realizing exactly when, and there was no turning back. Because now, I wasn't just being led, I was responding, and my every answer, it took me deeper into something that could no longer be ignored. Something bigger than the deal, bigger than marriage, something that involved power, control, and choices that couldn't be undone. And at the center of it all, he was still there. But now no further away, just waiting to see how far I would go without being forced. And that was the most dangerous part of all. And that was the most dangerous part of all, because there was no imposition, there were no direct orders pushing. There was space, and space means choice, and choice means responsibility. That's what started to weigh on me. In the following days, every decision I made was no longer just a reaction, and it became positioning. Even when I tried to keep my distance, even when I pretended to just watch, I was already involved. Inevitably, meetings have become more frequent, and my presence in them is no longer occasional. No one questioned anymore. No one showed surprise. It was as if that transition had already been accepted, or maybe planned from the beginning. I started to notice clearer pattern, routes being analyzed, messages being intercepted, small clashes happening far enough away to not generate panic, but close enough to keep everyone on their toes. The war continued, their silence, and every move seemed to push everything towards something greater. It was at one of these meetings that the first real shock NR in the field, but within the decisions themselves, one of the men suggested a direct attack. Fast, I need. The idea was simple: eliminate the threat before it grows, but there was risk too high, and for the first time I saw divergence. Not open, not chaotic, but present. Some agreed, others hesitated, and then he spoke without raising the tone, without imposing presence aggressively, but enough to put an end to any doubt. Said attacking first wasn't strength, it was a rush, and haste led to mistakes. The silence that followed was absolute, because that wasn't just a decision, it was a guideline, and no one there seemed willing to challenge. But something inside me reacted, not against him, but against the situation, because I've seen that pattern before in other contexts, in other territories, and I knew what came next. Too much control also created vulnerability, and before I could stop it, I spoke, not impulsively, but direct. He said waiting too long also had a cost. that giving the enemy time meant allowing him to organize himself better. And at that pace, they could be being surrounded without realizing it. The impact was immediate. Looking back, renewed tension, not because of the disagreement itself, but because I said that they're in that environment, but I didn't back down. Because at that point, retreating would be worse. He watched me, without interrupting, without reacting immediately. And that was even more intense, because it meant he was considering or weighing the risk of letting me continue. The seconds felt longer than they should have until he finally responded. Not contradicting, not confirming, but adjusting, said every strategy carries losses. But the difference was in choosing which losses were acceptable. That didn't cancel out what I had said, but it also didn't completely validate. It was balanced control again. And I understood at that moment that it wasn't just about winning. It was about how to win, and the way he handled it. It showed that each step was already being measured long before it happened. The discussion continued, but now with a new layer, deeper, more careful, and that made something. My voice had weight, even though it was still being tested. When the meeting ended, the environment did not return to normal immediately. There was residual tension, as if something had changed permanently. And there was. I felt it before I even left the room. Because this time, it wasn't just him who watched me. The others were also evaluating, with more attention, with more caution, and that completely changed the dynamic. Outside, the air felt heavier, or maybe it was just my perception changing. I walked without a clear destination, trying to organize everything that had happened, but it was difficult, because the more I thought, more evident was I was no longer just being led, I was interfering. And interference generates reaction always. That night, I couldn't ignore the growing sensation. Something was about to happen, not because there were clear signs, but because the balance was shifting, and balances are never broken. Without consequence, when I finally stopped, I realized I wasn't alone. He was already there. Like he knew exactly where I would be, or maybe had always been watching. But this time, his presence didn't just bring tension. I brought something different, something closer to recognition. Even if not declared, he didn't speak right away. Just stayed by my side, looking in the same direction, as if there was no need for words. And for the first time, the silence between us didn't feel like a test, but a shared choice. Still, I knew nothing there was simple, nothing was just what it seemed. And even in that calmest moment, there was a certainty impossible to ignore. Every step I took inside that place, I was approaching a point where there would be no more room to turn back. And when that moment came, it would no longer be about strategy. It would be about who I would really choose to be within that silent war. It would be about who I would really choose to be within that silent war. And that realization didn't disappear when the night ended. She stayed firmer, more present, as if my every action from then on was being watched, not just by him, but for something bigger. Decisions began to have immediate consequences. Small changes in the territory began to reflect choices made within those meetings. Routes have been changed, guards repositioned, messages began to circulate with more control. Nothing was visible to anyone looking from outside, but inside everything was in motion, and I could see because now I was part, even without a title. Even without an official name within that structure, I was inserted, and it brought something I didn't expect to feel. Responsibility, not by agreement, not for marriage, but by people, for the faces I saw every day, for the movements that started to make more sense. That was no longer just a strategy, it became real. It was at this point that everything began to change in a more concrete way. The first news arrived at dawn. One of the furthest posts had been attacked. Not a direct confrontation, but a quick dash, surgical. They didn't stay, they didn't try to dominate, they just caused damage, and they disappeared exactly as I predicted, exactly as I feared. The reaction was immediate, but controlled. Nobody panicked, no one lost the structure, but the tension. This time, it was impossible to disguise. I was called again. Without delay, no explanation. When I entered the room, the environment was different, heavier, more direct. There was no space for long analysis. It was a decision. He was already there as always, but now there was something more obvious. Absolute focus, not just strategic, but Guy's reports were quick objectives, minimum losses, calculated damage, but the message, they were testing closer limits, and that changed everything. He didn't ask. He distributed orders, immediate movements, reinforcement at specific points, sending small groups for reconnaissance, everything. Need, no excess, no waste. But in the middle of it, he did something no one seemed to expect. He looked at me directly and asked for my read, not as a general opinion, but about their next move. That was no longer symbolic, it was operational confidence, and the weight of it fell instantly. I couldn't make a mistake. Not at that moment, not with everything already in progress. My mind organized quickly, looking for patterns, linking information, and then I said that this was not an isolated attack. It was preparation, that they were measuring response time, testing reaction, assessing reach, and that the next move wouldn't be the same, it would be bolder. Closest, maybe not a direct attack on the center, but something that would force exposure silence. But this time, different, shorter, more objective. He nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something that was already being considered, and then adjusted. Small changes, but significant group redirection, changing observations, all based on that reading. That was the moment I understood there was no turning back. I wasn't just participating, I was influencing real decisions, and real decisions carry real consequences. When the meeting ended, no one left immediately. There was a silent understanding. Everything had changed. I felt it in your eyes, in the way the space around me felt different. No longer neutral, but defined. I was no longer just a presence. I was an active variable outside the territory, was already in motion. Orders being executed. People moving, silent preparation, taking shape, and in the middle of it all, I realized something I hadn't considered before. The enemy was not the only risk within that territory. There was also tension. There were also limits being tested, and not everyone would easily accept my position. This realization came too late, because when I turned, one of the men who were at the meeting was still there, observing different from others. Without disguising, without deviating, there was something in that look. Something that wasn't just doubt, it was rejection, and maybe something more. Something I still couldn't completely define, but that made it clear. Not everyone saw value in my presence, and that created a new type of threat, nearest more unpredictable. That night, the territory did not sleep. Constant motion, attentive silence, expectation. And I couldn't rest either, because now it wasn't just about what was coming from outside. It was about what was starting to form inside, and that made everything even more unstable, because external wars follow patterns, but internal conflicts, they break any prediction. And at the center of it all, I kept moving forward, not knowing exactly where it would end, but with the certainty that it was already too far to stop. That was the only thing that remained clear, as everything around began to move with more intensity. Because now there was no more room for hesitation. Actions were happening in real time, and each choice needed to keep up with this rhythm. The territory entered a different state. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't disorder, it was readiness. Everything worked more precisely, faster, more silent. The group's scent began to return with information, confirmed movements, repeated patterns, presences detected in points that were previously empty. They were getting closer, not directly, but constant, like a pressure that gradually increased, and that made everything more dangerous, because there was no single point I want to react. There were several scattered coordinates, and that required something more complex than strength. Required reading, anticipation, control. I started to follow more closely, not in order, but because I knew I needed to understand as much as possible. The reports started to make more sense. The roots started to connect in my mind, and a pattern began to form. Something that before seemed like just a test now he showed intent. They weren't just measuring, they were preparing a siege, not a direct attack, but a gradual limitation, restricting movement, forcing decisions, pushing territory to a specific point. When this realization was complete, I didn't wait to be called. I went to him, no ad, no formality, and that in itself was already a break from the norm. When I entered, he was alone, analyzing maps, scoring points, reviewing data, but he didn't seem surprised to see me. As if I already expected I didn't. waste time. I explained what I had observed. I showed how the movements were connected as spaces were slowly being closed. And then said, if they continue at this pace, they won't attack first. They will wait until any response from us is limited, until we are forced to act at the time they choose. The silence that came after was no doubt, it was calculation. He walked slowly through space, looking at the marked points, mentally adjusting what was already there, and then it stopped exactly by my side closer. Then, any time before, there was no unnecessary tension, but there was intensity, he confirmed, without saying directly. But by the way, it changed some markings for the way it redesigned possibilities. And then he made a decision. Different from the previous ones, more daring. He wouldn't wait for the sea to close, but I wouldn't attack directly. He would choose a specific point, a point that broke their pattern, that forced a reaction before the planned time. That was risky, but calculated, and for the first time I saw something different in not just control, but adaptation, and that made everything even more unpredictable. Orders began to be given immediately. Fast moves, group repositioning, silent preparation for something that couldn't fail. I remained there, observing, absorbing, until he spoke again. But this time, not about strategy, about me, said. I was starting to see how they saw. That this was not common, and that this kind of perception changed everything. There was no praise in the way it was said, but there was recognition, and that had more impact than anything else, because it made official something that, until then, was only implicit. I didn't respond right away, because at that moment any words would be less than what was already clear. He didn't insist, just came back into focus as I always did, but now the dynamics were different. I wasn't trying to understand the place anymore. I was part of it, and it brought a new layer of consciousness, because every decision from then on, it would also define me. Hours later, the first movements began, groups leaving in silence, routes being used accurately, nothing wasted, nothing improvised, and in the middle of it, internal tension still existed. I felt it in the eyes, in the way some avoided contact, and in others, who watched too much like that man from the previous meeting. He was still there, still attentive, but now there was something different. It wasn't just rejection, it was active distrust, as if waiting for an error, or maybe looking for an opportunity, and it confirmed what I already knew the conflict was, not just outside. That night, as the territory moved in, silence, I remained awake, tracking each return, every information, until finally the first signal came. One of the groups encountered resistance. Unplanned, not expected at that point, but significant enough to indicate something they already knew, or at least they suspected, and that changed the scenario again. Because now it was no longer just anticipation, it was direct confrontation, starting to and when that happens, no more room for slow adjustments from there. Each movement becomes definitive and every mistake irreversible. I felt it clearly, even before any official confirmation, because everything around had already changed. And inside me also, there was no longer any doubt. I was no longer just involved. I was committed to the outcome of that silent war, and whatever path it took now, it would be mine too. And whatever path it took now, it would be mine too. This realization did not bring immediate fear. Brought focus, because when there is no more distance, there is no more room for doubt. From there, everything became clearer. More direct information began to arrive more frequently. The advanced groups found resistance at more than one point. It was no longer a coincidence, it was an answer. They were reacting faster than expected, and that meant the movement had been noticed. Or in advance, inside the control room, the environment has changed again. There was no more space for long reading. Now it was execution under pressure. Maps have been constantly updated. New markings appeared. Routes were discarded, and for the first time, I saw something that hadn't appeared before. Urgency, don't get out of control. But real urgency. Decisions needed to be made at the right time. Not before, not after, and that made every second relevant. He was still at the center of everything, as always, but now, moving more. Adjusting, recalculating, responding without losing precision. Even with the scenario changing, it was at that moment that everything intensified. One of the groups sent did not return. The silence about them was louder than any report, because lack of information. At that point, it meant trouble and problems on the field. It meant exposure. The possibilities were few. Captured, eliminated, or being used as bait. And any of them changed the game. The reaction was not And this made clear the level of control still present. He didn't make an impulsive decision. He waited for enough data, even with the risk increasing, and then the choice came. A smaller team would be sent, not to rescue, but to confirm. This difference was essential because it showed priority. It wasn't about saving at any cost. It was about understanding before acting. And it reinforced everything I had already realized about him. But inside me, something reacted, because at that point, people were no longer just part of the strategy they had faced. History, presence, and ignoring it wasn't so simple. Even though I knew it was necessary, I remained silent, observing. But now, also feeling the weight of it. It was then that something unexpected happened. Confirmation came faster than expected. One of the explorers returned injured, exhausted, but aware. And what did he bring? Changed everything again. Not only had they been intercepted, they had been expected. The exact point, the exact moment. Nothing there was random. That was no longer a reaction. It was information. Someone was leaking data or being watched from within. The silence that took over the room. This time, it was different from everyone else. Heavier, most dangerous, because now the problem wasn't just outside. I was inside, and that broke any predictable pattern. The looks changed. Not just tension, but suspicious. Each person there became a possibility, and that completely changed the dynamic. I felt it immediately, because even without a history in that territory, I was also part of that space now, and that put me at the same risk, but different from the others. I was already being watched from the beginning, and it could both protect me, how much to condemn me. He did not show an exaggerated reaction, but something in him changed, in a subtle way, but definitive. The way he looked at each, the way you assessed the environment, everything became more precise, colder, further away. The orders that came later were different, less open, more restricted. Information began to be limited, divided, controlled at levels no one would have access to the whole, and that was necessary, but also dangerous. Because fragmented trust breeds instability, I remained there, absorbing every detail until I noticed something that few would note. He didn't exclude me. Even with everything going on, even with internal suspicion, I continued to have access. And that wasn't carelessness, it was choice. And that choice said more than any words. When I left the room, the territory looked the same, but it wasn't there. Was something in the air. Something invisible, but present. Distrust. And it spreads fast, faster than any external attack. I walked slowly, observing the faces, the interactions, the little signs, until you realize. The man who had been watching me before, he was there, but now more attentive than ever. And this time, there was no doubt he had also realized, and maybe I already had a conclusion. The problem, it was just that I didn't know yet if he was looking for the traitor or trying to protect one. And this difference, it was what would define the next movement within that territory. Because when the threat comes from within, there is no safe line, there is no neutral position, and any choice, even silent, it can be interpreted as side. And at that point, choose a side. It was no longer a future possibility, it was an immediate need. Even if it hadn't yet been stated out loud, it was an immediate need, even if it hadn't yet been stated out loud. And that was exactly what began to form in the following moment. Not as a direct order, but like an invisible pressure. Choosing a side was no longer a decision or distant. It was something that happened in every look, in every silence, in every word that was left unsaid. The territory continued to move. External operations continued. The groups were still moving. Strategies continued to be adjusted. But now there was a second, more dangerous, more unpredictable. The silent investigation. Nobody announced, nobody but everyone felt. Information began to arrive in a fragmented way. Groups began to be reorganized without clear explanation. Certain people no longer appear in positions they held before. And that was no coincidence. It was triage, it was filtering, reducing possibilities, approximating answers without creating panic, without generating immediate disruption, but leading everything to an inevitable point. I began to notice patterns within this new dynamic. Small tests being done, slightly altered information being distributed in different ways, as if each person received a specific version, and depending on where it leaked, the origin would be revealed. That wasn't just strategy, it was psychological precision, and that made everything even more tense. Because no one knew exactly what was being observed or when I was being tested, I remained attentive, controlling every reaction, every word, because now More than ever, any detail could be used. But even with all this control, something didn't fit, and this feeling started to grow until it becomes impossible to ignore the man who had been watching. He changed, not in an obvious way, but enough he started to move more cautiously, avoiding certain spaces, watching more than before, but not just me too. Everyone, and this was not the behavior of someone unprepared, it was from someone who knew or suspected. It was then that I realized he wasn't just suspicious, he was following the same pattern as me, and maybe reaching the same conclusion. The difference it was that I still didn't know which side he represented, and that made any approach risky. But ignoring was also a risk, because if he was right and I didn't realize it in time, the error would not be corrected, would be exploited. That night, external movement has reached a new level. One of the advanced points came into direct confrontation, without warning, no gradual preparation. It was fast, intense, and different from the previous ones. They didn't back down immediately. This confirmed what was already clear. The testing phase was over now. It was execution within the territory. The response was immediate: mobilized groups, reinforced defenses, even more restricted communication. But this time, there was something more. Internal pressure, because any failure now, it would not only be strategic, it would be interpreted as possible betrayal, and that completely changed the weight of each decision. I was called again, but this time, not for the main room. I was taken to a smaller space, more isolated, and when I entered, he was already there alone, as at other times, but the atmosphere was different. Closed, more direct, no room for ambiguity. He didn't start with questions about the territory, nor about external movement. He went straight. He asked who I trusted. The question was not simple, and there was no sure answer, because any name, it would be a choice, and any choice, it would be a position. I kept looking. I kept control, and I responded carefully. He said that trust at that point was not something stable, that everything was being tested, and that any certainty could be manipulated. The silence that came after it was longer, but not empty. He was analyzing not just the answer, but the way it was built, and then he said something that confirmed everything. Said betrayal never starts with intention, it starts with opportunity, and that in that territory, has anyone already crossed that line? Without realizing, there was no turning back. That wasn't an assumption, it was conclusion, and that completely changed the scenario. Because it meant he already had a target, or it was very close. He approached, once again reducing the distance, but this time without any smoothness. There was absolute focus, and then said that the next external move would be used as bait, not just for the enemy, but for anyone inside. That was risky, extreme, but effective. Why would it force a reaction? And reaction reveals intention. I understood immediately he wasn't just fighting a war. He was closing all the variables at once, and that meant that when that happened, there would be no room for error, not even for regret. When I left that space, the feeling was clear, the breaking much closer than before, and this time it wouldn't be silent, because when the enemy is outside and inside at the same time, the impact is never partial. It hits everything and everyone, no exception. And in the middle of it, I had already done mine, the choice. Even without saying it out loud, even without being directly obliged, because at that point, don't choose, it was time to choose. It was time to choose, and I felt the weight of that choice before anything even happened, because now everything was aligned to a single point. The bait had already been prepared, outward movements were underway. And within the territory, each piece was positioned. Nothing was announced, but everyone felt. The tension was no longer silent. It was dense. Gift, almost palpable orders, began to be executed with absolute precision. Groups sent exactly where they should be. Defenses adjusted to the necessary limit. Communication reduced to the essentials, but there was something different this time. Everything seemed exposed on purpose, as if certain loopholes had been left open, as if some paths were too accessible. And that wasn't a mistake. It was an invitation. The entire territory became part of the strategy. Each external movement was calculated, but each internal reaction was even more important. I stayed close, observing, knowing that this was the moment that had been building since the beginning. The external confrontation began in a controlled manner. One of the outposts was attacked again, but this time the answer came immediately, no recoil. Without hesitation, it was the first real direct shock, and he was not avoided, it was allowed. Meanwhile, within the territory, the real movement has begun. Small flaws started to appear. Communications that did not arrive, routes that were followed incorrectly, information that appeared where it shouldn't have. It was subtle, but enough. And then it happened. A message was intercepted, not coming from outside, but sent from within. The pattern left no doubt someone was passing information in real time. And that activated everything. The responses were immediate. Internal groups began to move. Specific points were isolated. Blocked paths, no fanfare, no chaos. But with absolute precision, I saw when heaved confirmation there was no surprise, execution only. As if that was exactly the moment I was waiting for. The name was not said out loud, but the direction was clear. And it took him exactly the man who had been watching the same one who avoided standards, the same one that always seemed one step ahead. Everything fell into place in a brutal way. He wasn't looking for the traitor. He was protecting his own position, or maybe trying to get out before being discovered, but it was too late. The siege closed quickly. No room to escape, no margin for error. When the confrontation finally happened, it wasn't chaotic. It was direct, controlled, but loaded with everything that had been accumulated. He tried to deny, tried to reverse, tried to buy time, but there was no more room for manipulation. The evidence was aligned. Each test, each information distributed, every reaction, everything pointed to him, and at that moment the internal war has come to an end. No need to prolong, no show. Just consequence. But the impact didn't end there, because while that was resolved inside, outside the confrontation continued. And now no leakage, no interference. The difference was immediate responses have become more effective, the most precise movement. Losses have been reduced, as if something that blocked the territory had been removed, and maybe it even had. When everything started to stabilize, silence returned. But not the same as before. It was different, cleaner, more defined. I stayed where I was, observing what was left of that moment, until I realized he was by my side again. Without warning, as always, but this time, his presence didn't just carry control. There was something clearer, more direct. He didn't say much. It wasn't necessary. Just looked, and in that look, there was recognition, not just for analysis or the decisions, but by choice. Because in the middle of all that, I didn't back down. I didn't omit. I was part, and this could not be ignored. Just one thing, that wars are not won with strength alone, but who stays with when everything becomes unstable. The words were simple, but enough, because they carried everything that had happened up to that point. I didn't respond. There was no need, because at that point, words no longer define anything. Stocks had already done this. The territory began to return to its rhythm, but not in the same state. There was change, there was adjustment, and mainly there was clarity. The external war had not yet ended, but now it was different. Now there was complete control, no interference, without a doubt, internal. And that changed the result, but inside me. The biggest change had already happened. I was no longer someone placed there by agreement. I wasn't just part of an alliance. I had chosen to remain, chosen to act, chosen to position myself, and that reset everything, including the way he saw me. And for the first time since Sea Hague, the distance between us is no longer a barrier. Not because it disappeared, but why is it no longer necessary? What existed now, it was not imposed, it wasn't strategic. It was built based on everything, tested everything that was exposed, everything that survived. And that was stronger than any agreement, more stable than any imposition, because it didn't depend on obligation. Depends on choice, and choices like that cannot be undone without consequence.